Pathologic 2 is, hands down, one of my favorite games of all time. The reasons for that are complex and impossible to summarize in a couple of sentences, but if I'd have to attempt to, it's because Pathologic 2 is an incredibly complex, multifaceted, and expertly designed evolution of its predecessor, which depicted one of the most unique and intriguing settings and narratives ever conceived in a video game, in my opinion. The thing has more layers than an onion. I made an hour-long, largely spoiler-free video on Pathologic 2 over 5 years ago now, not long after the game came out, in which I try to break down why I think this game is more than worth your time. And even that one, I feel like, barely scratches the surface. We're going to get a lot deeper into those games over the course of this video, but the main point that's important for now is that Pathologic 2 was a sort of remake, sort of sequel hybrid of the first game. Both take place during the same events, 12 days of a deadly viral outbreak in a remote town in the Steppe, and 3 healers of very different worldviews, ideologies, and methodologies in combating this plague are in town at the time, and they will clash during the course of the story on numerous occasions. But unlike in Pathologic 1, only one of the 3 playable characters' roots was realized for Pathologic 2 so far, the Haruspex, Artemi Burak, who grew up in the town Pathologic takes place in, studied steppe lore and medicine under his father, the town's primary healer's guidance, learned the fundamentals of surgery and herbalism in the tradition of the kin, the native tribe who perceives all things in the world, physical and spiritual, to be intricately connected. The roots of the other 2 playable characters in the original, the Bachelor of Medicine, Daniil Dankovsky, and Clara, the Changeling with the healing/killing touch, were initially meant to be developed and released as massive add-ons for Pathologic 2. Now, Pathologic 2 was released in 2019, and after the game's launch, developer Icepick Lodge was forced to restructure and downsize. They focused on various smaller projects until they secured the funding for the eventual development of the next chapter in the saga, the Bachelor Route. And at the time of release of this video, about 3 months ago, the studio finally officially announced Pathologic 3, to the surprise of many, myself very much included. Wait, what, Pathologic 3? Yeah, it came as a surprise to many. Pathologic 3 will be the long-awaited Bachelor's Route, but instead of making it a sort of massive DLC to Pathologic 2, Icepick Lodge decided to fundamentally overhaul the game and completely redesign Daniil's 12 days during the outbreak. So much so that it warranted becoming its own new standalone numbered entry in the Pathologic franchise. And ever since this announcement, I've been bubbling with excitement for what's to come, and especially because the new approach for the Bachelor's Route, including the new mechanics and systems that were showcased so far, had me going all galaxy brain about it. And I knew I just had to talk about it, in this case long before the game itself, scheduled for a full release within 2025, is out. So, the way I had initially planned this video was a little bit different to what it ultimately became. Originally, I wanted to have an in-depth look at the trailers and all the material that's been released on Pathologic 3 so far, point out apparent changes, new systems and mechanics from them, and then segue into a bit of a speculative analysis of how the game might actually look once it comes out. And then also explore themes and theorize a bit on where I believe the Bachelor's story in Pathologic 3, thematically and philosophically, might go. But instead, we're gonna do something a little bit different today. I actually reached out to Icepick Lodge, and the game's narrative director, Alphyna, happily agreed to have a conversation with me in which I had the opportunity to ask her a whole cartload of questions about the game's development, new mechanics, themes, about the upcoming Prologue chapter, Pathologic Quarantine, and a lot more. So, first of all, hey Alphyna, thank you so much for joining me on this one and for sharing your insight on Pathologic 3 with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm very excited for this. So, here's how we're going to do this. Alphyna and I recorded our conversation beforehand, and throughout this video, I will move back and forth between question and answers and more regular video essay bits, and I'm going to try to seamlessly let them flow into each other. The footage you'll be seeing will be taken from all the material on Pathologic 3 that's available to me at this point in time. That's the reveal trailer, 2 devlog videos Icepick Lodge released so far on their YouTube channel, exclusive screenshots, and B-roll handed to me by the publisher Hype Train Digital, plus a good handful of footage that Alphyna provided me with that hasn't been shown anywhere yet. Plus, whenever it fits what we're currently talking about, footage from Pathologic 1 and 2. I'll have a little caption on screen so you'll always know which game you're currently looking at. But hey, before we deep dive into Pathologic and get going with the interview and analysis, I'd like to give a spotlight to the sponsor of this video, which is HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a food delivery service that delivers weekly meal kits directly to your door that you can assemble from a huge selection of over 50 dinner options, including fast and simple quick meals for those with little time on their hands, a big selection of market items to suit your personal tastes and preferences. I've been vegetarian for ages, for instance, and as such, I'm really happy with the reliably varied selection and meat-free options, but there's a lot more. Ultimately, what I enjoyed the most about HelloFresh's service was that it kept adding constant variety to our nutrition, gave us lots of fun ideas, and made it effortless to add lots of veggies to our dishes on the regular. And what I appreciate most is the flexibility. Change the amount of meals anytime, or sit out a week or more if you're traveling or just want a little break. There's lots of reasons why HelloFresh might work for you, if you want to eat better and healthier, save time, money, and stress, you name it. So hey, if you'd like to give HelloFresh a try, then you can actually help me out by following the link in the description or use my code when you sign up. If you use my code, you'll get free breakfast for life. One free breakfast item per box will be included in your meal kit as long as your subscription is active. So thanks so much again for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to Pathologic 3. So to start things off, let's give our guest of honor a chance to introduce herself to the audience. Alphyna, you've worked on Pathologic 2 in the role of narrative designer and left the company sometime after the game's launch for a while. I was really happy to hear that for Pathologic 3, you've rejoined Icepick Lodge in the role of narrative director. For how long have you been back on the team, and what are your current responsibilities in the project? And how does this new position of yours differ from your work on Pathologic 2?
Yeah, I'm very excited to be back on the team as well. So, for those uninitiated, I've worked at Icepick Lodge during the production of Pathologic 2, during the whole period of production. And back then, the narrative team was very small. We basically had Nikolai, the creative lead and the main writer, and me, the narrative designer, who supported the writing with structure, with additional texts and everything. We also had a couple of junior writers as well, but they just did bits and pieces. On Pathologic 3, we have a much larger writing team.
Okay.
So it has several people in different roles, and I was invited back to the team in November, so it was recently.
Okay.
To provide better structure to this team, and when I came back to the project, I saw a ginormous bunch of brilliant ideas, of very good writing, of very good quests, stories and concepts, but they were a bit unstructured. So my job currently is to add structure, to, emphasize the important bits and maybe make some other bits more optional and, more reactive to the player's choices, to make sure that the main characters have enough screen time, to make sure that every concept is iterated upon during the whole course of the plot. So basically, giving this sort of high-level direction to the narrative. I'm very involved with the low-level direction as well. I do quest design, I work with artists, I work with the designers as well, but what I'm trying to emphasize here was that we had a much smaller team on Pathologic 2, and we have a larger team now, so it requires a person to, to conduct, to serve as a conductor.
Yeah, like a conductor.
Yes, and that's what I'm doing in this orchestra.
So you're basically putting the glue in between the seams so that everything holds together and is...
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So before we dig into things like game mechanics, systems, narrative themes, and all that jazz, I'd like to ask you about the current state of Pathologic 3's production. As I recall, Pathologic 2's sales figures sadly ended up somewhat behind expectations back then, and Icepick Lodge stated that they were forced to downsize and focus on very smaller projects for the time being, before being able to refocus their efforts on this long-anticipated Bachelor's Route and take it into full production. And evidently, we're here at this point now through a cooperation with the new publisher, Hype Train Digital. Alphyna, can you give us an overview of Pathologic 3 from the production side at this point in time? I know this is probably difficult to pin down given the sort of erratic nature of the whole project over the last years, but so how long has the game effectively been in development at this point in time? Okay,
so to give you a sensible answer to this question, I need to sidestep a bit first and explain what Icepick Lodge is. While we honestly never marketed ourselves as such. Icepeak Lodge, in truth, is not a traditional game development company at all. It's much closer, I remember someone calling it a rock band. It's much closer to an association of like-minded individuals who create things that they find meaningful. And while I think that sounds awesome, I've honestly never, ever worked in such a horizontal environment. So this is a studio where a lot of decisions are discussed among all members. And when you try to make meaningful games as a collective, you need to discuss them. And you need everyone to pitch in. And that's a great environment. Honestly, I've never felt so elated and free as here. But of course, it also has its downsides.
Absolutely, yeah.
The main downside is chaos and bad production management, because when you have a lot of ideas, you genuinely want to try things, you want to experiment, and that leads basically to spending money unwisely, shall I put it this way. So,
interesting.
Yes, the studio had to downsize, and Icepeak Lodge went on to make a couple of smaller games, hoping, to sell these products and find ways to create Pathologic 3, to create Bachelor's story, to create Changeling story, but it took some time. So what I'm saying here is that the studio has not been actively working on Pathologic 3 during all this period since the release of Pathologic 2. I think that the active production, it's 2 years and a half maybe of active production at this point. And we'll need, I won't say numbers, but we'll need some more time, but we can already see the finish line at the point where we are now.
Beautiful. Roughly how many people in-house, not speaking external contractors or something at Icepeak Lodge at the moment, are currently working on Pathologic 3? Doesn't have to be exact, but what's the ballpark?
The scope is around 30.
Okay.
One more thing, again, Icepeak Lodge has always been this sort of collective with a core team, but also an areola of people around it. So me personally, for example, I haven't been out of touch all this time. I've been doing some part-time work for the studio in these years. We kept in touch. So there are a lot of people, for example, who worked on Pathologic 2, who worked on previous projects, who are now otherwise employed, but they do some part-time work. But since you're probably mostly interested in scope, in terms of scope, it's around 30 people in-house.
Cool. Next question that I have here, you kind of brushed on this already, and I just want to ask, as far as you can quantify that, how complete is the game at the current point in time? And what I was wondering, you said you're seeing the finish line now, and so is it in a state where it's fully playable, feature complete, and there's still a lot of polishing to be done, or is there still major elements that plan to still be developed and implemented?
No, it's definitely closer to the former. So I'd say it's 80% feature complete, maybe at this point, maybe even more, honestly. It's more about polishing, balancing, and connecting systems in unexpected ways at this point. Honestly, again, it's great to see that game design has some leeway, to try things out, but you can play the game currently.
Cool.
It's not content complete. So currently it's more about producing content. Like I said, we have a bigger narrative team this time around, so we come up with a lot of quests, and we need people to implement those quests, to use mechanics, to use additional visuals and create additional visuals, to just script them. And that's a lot of work as well. So I'd say we're maybe 60% content complete. 60% might sound like a small number at this point in development, but it's very regular content. So it's not creative search. We have the pipeline. We just keep, pushing out quests at this point.
The plot points are laid out, basically, but the prose has to be written and that kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly. But that's kind of, typical work, shall I call it.
Yeah, this actually already also answers one of my next questions, where I was wondering, if the voice production has already started, or if there's, since there's still a lot of the writing to be done, I assume that this will start at a later point in time?
I keep answering your questions from the future. It's like I'm traveling in time.
Yeah, you seem to have some mind-reading abilities, apparently.
Yeah, so first of all, we actually considered full voice acting at one point, but it doesn't make sense for Pathologic.
Okay.
The prose is just not written that way, and having to listen to voiceovers. It was even financially feasible, but I'm not sure it would make the game better. So what we'll have again is partial voice acting with characters speaking out lines that aren't written, but instead...
Like in Pathologic 2, basically, yeah.
Yes, so the idea there was that you're kind of peeking into their soul and inner thoughts, you know, like touching upon them in ways that aren't realistic, but instead you get a better feeling for the character. So we'll have that. We'll have partial voiceover for the protagonist. We'll have several voiced scenes, so there will be a voiceover here and there.
Cool.
And it's already being recorded, and we have recruited the same voice actor for The Bachelor in Russian, and are currently working on getting in touch with the same voice actor in English. It's not, surprisingly enough, as easy as it sounds, because voice actors work with agencies, and sometimes you can't get a direct contact, but we are working with the same direction managers as before as well, so hopefully it all works out.
Yeah.
And obviously we have some new characters as well, and they'll have new voices, so that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so when Pathologic 2 came out, especially because the game had the big 2 in its title, many people assumed it to be a sequel to the first game and naturally asked, do I have to have played the first game in order to understand or properly enjoy the second? I've answered that question to people a few times in the past, also in the video on Pathologic 2 I did back in the day, and the short answer to this is no. A slightly more elaborate answer is, I actually envy you if you haven't played the first game and start your journey with 2. See, as I said, Pathologic 2 is a quasi-remake, quasi-sequel to the first game. The game's story is framed within a Brechtian theater stage play. It's insinuated that what occurs during the 12 days of the outbreak is a performance by actors assuming a stage role. Among them, the 3 protagonists, the Bachelor, the Haruspex, and the Changeling. There's a lot more to that, and it's not all that straightforward. The games obfuscate their narrative layers to the point of absolute brainfuck quite often, but when it comes to Pathologic 2, it can be considered a sequel in that it purports that those 12 days of the outbreak are the same 12 days that we play through in the original. Only now the play is being performed all over again by the same actors only years later. As such, it is in many ways a completely different interpretation of the source material. So I think the question would be best answered if you ask yourself, if I want to see a stage play of Hamlet, do I have to have seen the original performance of Hamlet in the early 1600s to enjoy it? Of course, for those who have played the first game, which is an incredibly dense and opaque, and oftentimes surprisingly boring beast to tame, you'll get a lot of references and nods and subtextual changes, etc., but you really don't have to have played it. When it comes to the gameplay and narrative design, I think experiencing the events of the town's pandemic firsthand, unbiased, without any expectation of how the game realizes this through the simulation of a town and its harsh survival mechanics, is the better experience in some ways. There are twists and turns in the progression of the outbreak and how they're implemented in-game that I wish I didn't anticipate because of my knowledge of the first Pathologic when I played 2 for the first time. Plus, Pathologic 2 is simply the far more fleshed out game and goes a long way to take the very heady concept that the first game tackles and translates them into a far more open-ended and reactive simulation. So my bottom line is, no, you do not have to have played the first in order to play the second. You can enjoy these games in any order you like and won't have a worse experience for it. Why do I go through this again? Because with the big number 3 in the upcoming Bachelor Route-focused sequel, many people, especially those new to the series, will inevitably end up asking the same question here as well. Do I have to have played either the original Pathologic or the Haruspex's Route in Pathologic 2 in order to play Pathologic 3 proper, or both? Now, since I personally haven't played Pathologic 3 yet, I can only follow my hunch and speculate that the answer is a clear no, you can perfectly start with Pathologic 3. But I'd like to forward that question. Alphyna, I'd love to hear how you'd answer someone who asks you, do I have to have played the previous entries before playing Pathologic 3?
Your hunch is correct. Pathologic, generally speaking, is an exercise in subjective storytelling. We have one town, one plague happening there, and 3 characters, and each of those characters is the protagonist of their own story. Like, you know, in life, each of us is the protagonist of our own life story. So you can play Pathologic 3 not having played either the original Pathologic or Pathologic 2. However, playing Pathologic 2, learning the story of Haruspex would probably enhance your experience of Pathologic 3, because some events, of course, either the same or corresponding, some themes connect and clash. You'll see a lot of Haruspex in the Bachelor's story. So you can play them in any order. There is no canonical order to play these games.
Perfect. Yeah, and people also really like to ship those two. So maybe that gives more material to ship them as
Sure,
well. Yeah.
sure. I mean, that's just the natural flow of things.
Exactly. Enemies to lovers, that sort of thing. In the original Pathologic, the Bachelor's Route was considered and even explicitly recommended to new players as the ideal choice for a first playthrough, since, you know, Daniil is an out-of-towner and first-time visitor with little to no knowledge to the intricacies of the place, and therefore serves as a perfect vessel for player exposition. And I was wondering, and I'm sure this was answered somewhere, but I was wondering, do you know why back then it was decided to start with and focus on the Haruspex route first when Pathologic 2's development began?
Yeah, I know the actual honest, non-marketing bullshit answer.
Yes, please.
I was kind of the person who pushed for it.
Okay.
Because, let's be honest, we did intend to make 3 stories in one game originally for the reimagining of Pathologic. So my personal reasoning was that the Bachelor's story is already fleshed out.
Right.
It's so the issue with the original Pathologic was that, like, the Bachelor's story took 60% of the content, the Haruspexes took like 30, and the Changelings took like 10.
Yes.
So there was a very clear fall of quality, not with the ideas, with how the stories were implemented.
The execution, yeah, it was...
Yes, with the execution. So my thinking was, let's start with the guy who was underdeveloped and make sure we develop him. Because the decision was made back when we just wanted to kind of keep closer to the original vision of the old Pathologic. And then we'll just repeat the Bachelor story.
Right.
That was the thinking. And then it all went sideways.
Yeah.
It was not our goal to release the game Haruspex first, so to speak. That's why we worked on Bachelor even back then. That's why the Marble Nest, which ended up being the DLC, is the Bachelor story. So we kept developing all 3 of them, the Haruspex, the Bachelor, and the Changeling. But since I personally kept pushing for thinking more about the Haruspex because he was underdeveloped in the original game, it kind of ended this way.
Cool. Thank you. That's a great answer. That gives me a lot of closure. Now I know. So would you say that Pathologic 3, once it's out with its focus on The Bachelor, will similarly serve as a great entry point to the franchise for players who've never played neither the original nor Pathologic 2?
We feel that for a wider audience, the Bachelor story might be a better entry point for a couple of reasons. So the essay that launched Pathologic in the Western world, written on Rock, Paper, Shotgun, was called, as I recall, Best Game You've Never Played.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
And there exists this phenomenon of games that solely exist for content makers, and people enjoy talking about them, enjoy looking at them, but they don't necessarily want to play them.
Right.
There are a lot of games like this. I feel like, for example, the Fear and Hunger phenomenon is somewhat like this. It's a grueling game to play. I love it, but sometimes watching an essay on it is, for some people, a better experience than actually suffering through its gameplay.
Very true, yeah.
So the Bachelor in Pathologic 3 is different from the Haruspex in the Pathologic 2 game. Since he's, a star, a person from the capital, he is granted executive rights in the town as soon as he arrives. He's respected by the town's elites. He doesn't have to fight for his life.
Yeah.
He faces completely different challenges, equally painful in my opinion, but painful in a different way.
Okay.
And I feel that for some people who were confused or maybe intimidated by some aspects of the gameplay of the series before this, Pathologic 3 may be this sort of fresh perspective that can be an interesting entry point. Because basically, if you've made wrong choices, if you failed a quest, so to speak, I made like air quotes here. If you've failed something, so to speak, you can redo it,
Yeah. If you got an outcome that doesn't sit right with you, basically, yeah.
Yeah. So this fear of making the wrong choice is gone now. Instead, you may find that there are no right choices in story, but that's a completely different beast.
Yes.
So if you have this sort of anxiety that you'll make a choice and like break the game and you'll have to start from scratch, this is something that the Bachelor story doesn't have. It has different pains and challenges. So if that is something that you were intimidated by before, and that is something that prevented you from trying Pathologic, Pathologic 3 might be a better entry point for you.
Interesting. We're also going to get a bit deeper into this.
Mm-hmm.
The Pathologic games, as I mentioned, take place in a remote city far out in the steppe in an undefined industrial age time period that is doomed by a highly infectious and deadly disease. The city is governed by 3 highly influential families, or rather factions with different leading ideologies: humility, utopianism, and preservation, who will come into conflict with each other over the course of the story, not just in terms of how to deal with the pandemic at hand. In Pathologic 2, you take the role of Artemi Burach, son of the town's Dr. Isidor Burach, who literally passed away right before your arrival. As a surgeon who returns from his not entirely successful medical studies in the capital and who has a connection to the traditional indigenous steppe ways of healing, you are one of the few people in this town with professional medical knowledge, so your bloodied hands will likely become an invaluable asset during this outbreak. The events of the game are separated in days, and that's an important factor. Time passes continuously. Everything plays out in real time. Each day goes from, surprise, midnight to midnight, but the things that occur in this town do so no matter if you're there or not to witness them. This is not a game that waits for the protagonist to show up. If you're not there, the plague, as well as all the characters involved, won't patiently wait for you to be there, and everything will end in exactly 12 days. So make good use of your time, think about what you want to do and which activities are a waste of your time, and don't sleep the days away. Time is a central currency in this game. The town is an open world in which you can technically enter every single house, which is not always legal and desired by those dwelling there, so townfolks generally don't like you a lot for breaking into their places and robbing them, and you will interact and talk with key figures during the outbreak. Your actions will possibly save or condemn lives, and your choices will influence the path this outbreak takes. The game has a strong survival aspect. Everything is about survival. Yours, the town's, its inhabitants, and you constantly struggle with hunger, thirst, and fatigue. So you have to scavenge everything you can find, including trash bins. I'm sure there's some symbolism in that, and barter with pretty much everyone in the streets, including the children, who are not as innocent and helpless as you might think, and who play a very important role in the whole constellation. The town really has its very own economy. Prices of everyday items undergo massive inflation because during a deadly plague, as we all experience, suddenly money itself becomes pretty much worthless. So most of the time, you're going to trade items that people really need rather than paying them with paper bills and coins. And the scarcer food and resources become, because the town is quarantined, the more ridiculously overpriced stuff gets in stores. And figuring out how trading with the townspeople works, which prices are reasonable and which ones are cutthroat, and who to trade with to get what you want is a central thing to learn in this game. It's clever. I could write 1,000 words just to attempt to answer the question what Pathologic is about at its core, but I'd love to redirect the question to you, Alphyna, and ask, if you had to give an elevator pitch and you have to get across in your own words, what is Pathologic as a whole about? How would you approach that? I know it's a mean question.
Yeah, if I were to give an elevator pitch of Pathologic, I would fail miserably.
Understandable.
But to me, the most interesting, the most important element of Pathologic is subjective storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So the core inspiration for me personally has always been Rashomon,
yes.
A Japanese movie with 3 characters giving an account of events and each of them telling those events differently.
Yes.
This is exactly what Pathologic is about. It's about the same place, the same events, and 3 very different people with 3 very different worldviews, living their lives in very different ways. So the most meaningful part of Pathologic for me is how these games use stories, use visuals, use mechanics to show that different people live in completely different worlds even when they are in the same town. So, to give you an elevator pitch, the three protagonists view the world so differently that since Earth is a living creature for the Haruspex, when he pours blood into the earth, it produces medicinal herbs.
Yes.
The Bachelor is a rational man, so when he pours blood onto the ground, it just rots.
Yes.
And the Changeling lives in a story of her own, shall we put it this way. So when she pours blood on the ground, it speaks to her.
Right.
And this is what happens in the game's mechanics. And this is how we show how different their perspectives are.
Yeah, exactly. How even though these three characters share the same material space, their individual perception of the world essentially creates an actually different personal reality for each of them. This is interesting and also a great segue because you already mentioned how Daniil, for instance, in the Bachelor's Route, won't have to concern himself with monetary problems at all, which is quite the stark contrast to the Haruspex, who was broke and penniless and had to struggle with a stark inflationary economy and rummage through garbage bins and trade his precious belongings away for scraps of food in order not to starve. Which gets me to my next point, survival. Pathologic 2 is mechanically a survival game at heart. Now, I've said this in the past, I fully understand and respect the genre of survival games, but I personally rarely feel drawn to games that are just about the push and pull of survival at its core, just for the sole sake of this. And yet, some of my favorite games of all time, like Darkwood, like Ice Pick Lodge's The Void, and of course also Pathologic, are built exactly around survival mechanics at its core. The difference for me with these games is that they use the survival framework for how the mechanics under the hood are employed to create a ludonarrative experience that is frankly impossible to achieve in any other medium. Which plays into the harshness of it, the difficulty. One favorite personal example of mine was how during my first playthrough of Pathologic 2, after struggling every step of the way to get by, to not starve while fighting tooth and nail to fight the overwhelming odds of the spreading plague, one day I was called to the town hall where I was given access to the Fund, a pool of resources created to support local doctors in their fight against the plague. And when I opened that cabinet and found it filled with bread and meat and drugs and ammunition and money, all for me to take freely, I will admit that I let out an audible gasp and I could feel my tear ducts well up after all the struggling. I've never experienced anything quite like this in any video game, and as I said, this is just one of many examples of how these games employ harsh and unforgiving mechanics to make players emotionally resonate with the complex narrative gestalt they're but a small part of. So bottom line is, one of Pathologic 2's major themes is survival. It's been said that, compared to Pathologic 1, the Bachelor's Route in Pathologic 3 will focus less on survival elements, as Daniil both is a man of science and a man of means and influential connections, in favor of more cerebral detective work, academic research, medical studies, etc. So I'd like to ask you, how strongly and in which ways has the element of day-to-day survival been pulled back for Pathologic 3? So will hunger, thirst, fatigue, and these things still play a role? Or are they like completely removed? How can we envision that?
Yes, they are completely removed, and I understand.
Removed.
Yes, I understand that it's a huge departure from the previous game, but we've considered them and we realized they just don't make a lot of sense for the Bachelor.
They're in the way now, basically.
Yes. So he's provided for, he is fed, he always has access to money and water. Just to be clear, there is an HP bar in the game, you can die mechanically, so you're not immortal yet.
Yes, yet.
Instead, the Bachelor has two main enemies. One of those is the plague, obviously.
Yes.
And the other is himself. So the Haruspex has always been about the body. He is a surgeon, he's a butcher, he cuts out organs. So it made sense for him to struggle with his own body. The Bachelor is all about the mind. So instead of managing his hunger, he has to manage his own mind. And he struggles with how his own head works. And he has to balance his states to even be able to do something. So there will be survival, but it's not the natural biology like hunger that will become your enemy, but your own thoughts?
Honestly, wow, this is already a pretty big surprise to me. And not in a bad way, because it feels thematically very fitting indeed. Just how strongly the day-to-day survival elements have been pulled back for The Bachelor. This definitely makes me even more curious to see how this will play out in the game once it's out. And it's also another really good segue to my next point, which is difficulty. The Pathologic games have a reputation for being quite difficult, and Pathologic 2 definitely made some headlines in regards to that around the time of its release. It came out right as the debate over friction and difficulty in games / the power of player disempowerment was heating up, and a lot of people criticized its high difficulty upon launch. I personally think Iceberg Lodge handled the feedback extremely well with the swift inclusion of highly granular survival difficulty sliders that allowed players to customize and fine-tune the challenge level to their personal strengths and weaknesses, a way to give a far wider range of players access to the game while still emphasizing how the feeling of disempowerment is core to the experience. Now, since The Bachelor is going to play so differently mechanically compared to the Haruspex, are you planning any similar accessibility features in Pathologic 3? Or let me phrase it differently, has Iceberg Lodge quote-unquote learned from the feedback around Pathologic 2's launch and considered the inclusion of adaptive difficulty options or other ways to provide accessibility from the ground up for Pathologic 3?
So this is a fascinating conversation for me personally, especially since I'm a huge fan of Souls-likes and games like Hollow Knight, and I understand full well that I would change the difficulty to easy in a heartbeat if I were given the option, but instead I had to learn, and I appreciate that. However, after years of consideration, I personally have come to realize that I don't necessarily like the term difficulty and difficult in games, unless we're talking about specific genres like, I don't know, rhythm games, where, the rhythm can be tighter or slower. Sure, there the term difficulty makes sense. But for games like Pathologic, where game design exists to be a vehicle for some ideas, for the character's worldview, we don't need to focus on, how many tries it would take the player to do something. That's not the mindset that we approach this with. Instead, the terms I personally use for how the game has to feel are bleak and grueling. So Pathologic is a bleak story. It's grueling in that you're not supposed to feel empowered. I really like the term disempowerment.
Yes, very accurate.
So to keep those emotions, to create those emotions for the player, we don't necessarily need to focus on making sure the game's economy is super tight and they need to trade this specific item at this specific time. There are other ways to achieve this effect. And in Bachelor, we are absolutely exploring those options. There is also another very important element here of their personal stories. The Haruspex is a man of the earth. He is a warm, living person who honestly wants to live a life in a human society. The Bachelor is a much more Nietzschean figure. His starting quest in the game is to defeat death, which is, kind of ambitious. He wants to become something more. So fully disempowering him up until the end of the game would not make a lot of sense, because the Haruspex is not searching for power for himself, but the Bachelor is. So he will look for ways to change things, to make things right. And there will be ways in the game to overcome this feeling of disempowerment, which does not obviously mean grab a bigger gun and stuff like that. Of course not. But your original question was whether we'll have difficulty options, and the answer is instead of doing that, we try to design the game in a way where they aren't needed.
I see. Yeah, that answered my question perfectly, because while it was a great response back around Pathologic 2's launch to swiftly deliver those difficulty options, ultimately a system to manually tweak the game like a set of sliders is more of an after-the-fact solution, while the holy grail for a game designer is always to, design from the ground up in a way that something like that won't be necessary at all. And also, it seems to make a lot of sense thematically, considering how different the gameplay focus points of Pathologic 3 are going to be compared to Pathologic 2. So let's talk a bit more about that and dig much deeper into the themes and mechanics. The Bachelor, Daniil Dankovsky, is an ambitious academic and renowned thanatologist, meaning someone who studies death. He travels to the town with the ambitious objective of discovering a way to, once and for all, defeat death. But And I love the irony of the narrative hook in the first Pathologic. The person he intends to meet, the patriarch of the influential Kine family, who promised to reveal to him absolutely vital and groundbreaking information for the Bachelor's academic pursuit, turns out to have died exactly the night before Daniil's arrival. And players are confronted with a regular Agatha Christie-esque locked room murder mystery. And before long, we find out that his murderer was none other than the very sand plague that is about to plunge the town in chaos, misery, and death for the next 12 days. As a man of science who holds rational thought above all else, his methods will inadvertently clash with the more spiritually receptive, grounded, and in many ways more practical approaches of both the Haruspex and the Changeling. And this clash of ideologies and methodologies is really one of the core themes of Pathologic when it comes to its three protagonists. So, for the case of Pathologic 3, with its complete focus on the Bachelor, Alphyna, how would you summarize Daniil's ideology and motivations, as well as his character development in this regard, throughout the narrative of Pathologic 3?
So, Daniil Dankovsky is a researcher of death from the capitals.
A thanatologist, yeah.
Yes, a thanatologist who arrives to this small backwards town. But it's important to understand that his goal is not to improve human longevity. He literally wants to defeat death. He has this very ambitious and very existential goal of overcoming human nature, basically, of finding ways to be something more, which means immortality, but again, not immortality necessarily in the practical sense. It's not like that he wants to live for 300 years. He wants to defeat the boundaries that hold humanity back. And that's his main driving motivation for everything. However, he is also a very rational, a very scientific man. He is rational to a fault. There might be some things he can't see or understand because he's too rational, he's not open-minded enough, and he might struggle with that. Because, who knows, perhaps to defeat death you need to look at a wider picture. So, for example, in the game he can read the things around him. He's so rational and he's so used to the written word that he sees written words everywhere around him. So that is something that kind of obscures the actual nature of things from him, you know, in a way. And I'm mentioning that because I think that it's important that while we love all our protagonists and each of them has their own truth, each of them also has their own limitations. So the Haruspex was maybe a bit too trusting, a bit too simple in some regards, you know. He was led by his heart a bit too much, you know?
Yes.
And the Bachelor might be a bit too rational, a bit too lofty, a bit too high-headed. But he's a utopian as it is, so he does genuinely believe that the better world is possible. Now, how many bodies you need to lay in the foundation of that better world is the question.
Oh yeah, now we're getting to the real meat of the narrative, right? How to weigh your personal goals against the fate of the population and the individual, and how to justify the sacrifices this requires. This is, for the Bachelor, really very appropriately Nietzsche. He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster.
Yes, exactly.
So, Pathologic's narrative is framed in a stage play, with Pathologic 2 neither exactly being a sequel nor a remake of the first game, but better described as a new performance of the same play, but re-envisioned and reenacted, insinuating that each performance of a piece will naturally offer a new take on the source material. So for Pathologic 3, how important was it to ensure for these aspects, like ideology, character motivation, development, philosophical themes, etc., to be coherent with the Bachelor as we know him from the first Pathologic?
Oh no, it's absolutely the same character. We love and respect the original Pathologic still very much, and we want to tell the story of that person just in new and better ways. Just like with Pathologic 2, it's a different staging of the same play and the same story. So the core principles, the core personality, the core ideas and themes remain the same, but we changed some narrative devices, obviously. Some themes were added because they just appeared naturally as we elaborated upon Daniil's life in the capital. In the original Pathologic, you just see him arrive to the town and you know small bits and pieces about his life in the capital. but they're very much in the background.
And now you're living it, basically, in parts.
Yeah, now, you won't see his daily routine in the capital, obviously, but you will see some bits of the capital, you will see more flashbacks and more pieces of the capital story, and that creates additional tension and adds more themes to the main story as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's grab a magnifying glass and have a closer look at what's actually been shown so far. For this, I'm going to have a look at the Pathologic 3 teaser trailer, the fact sheet that was released with the press kit alongside the trailer's release, various B-roll clips given to me by the publisher, as well as Alphyna herself, and the recently released devlog on hospital gameplay, as well as a handful of screenshots that have been made public so far, and see what we can deduce from it. So the first thing that's interesting is that we see Daniil being interrogated by the powers that be about the events of the outbreak after they occurred, not in the town itself, but in the capital. And during the interrogation, he gives his statements on the events, which is framed by phrases that consciously play with grammatical tempus. This will occur yesterday. This has already happened tomorrow. So, as it's been stated, unlike in the Haruspex's route, where we experienced the 12 days of the outbreak chronologically, one day after the next, in Pathologic 3 we are going to relive individual days of the outbreak, not necessarily in the order they occurred, as Dankovsky retells them. This creates a possibility of, for instance, witnessing the repercussions of certain actions before the actions themselves occurred. In the press release, this approach for the game's narrative and gameplay structure is referred to as surrealist time management, a way of realizing through game design that time is more complex than we perceive it. Time is not linear, but more like scrambled eggs. One thing that made me wonder is if it will be possible to play through certain days multiple times, which would essentially be Daniil revising a statement and going, well, hang on a minute, actually it happened this way. Alphyna, can you confirm or deny that this is a possibility, repeating and essentially redoing certain days of the outbreak in Pathologic 3?
Yes, I can confirm that this is exactly how it plays, and the narrative device around it, it's how you described. So, Bachelor is being investigated, is being questioned in the capital by the powers that be about his actions which led to the demise of the town. And they keep accusing him, and he keeps saying, wait, no, that's not how it went.
Right.
And they keep going back and forth, reiterating upon events. And in terms of gameplay, that means that, yes, the player can go back in time and make different choices, replay some events, undo quests, undo the choices they've made. And now the actual questions here are A, is it free or does it come at a price?
Yeah.
And B, why did we even do that? Like, that's probably, to me, personally, that's the biggest departure from the older games. To me, it's a bigger departure than the lack of survival, because the Marble Nest didn't have survival, and it still very much felt like a pathologic story.
True, yeah.
But this non-linear storytelling exists for a reason that I'd rather keep secret for a while. Let's just say that this whole narrative frame of you being questioned and investigated and telling your story may or may not be true.
Okay.
Let me say this. This sort of non-linear, quote-unquote, time travel storytelling is not a gimmick that we threw after, we came up with some quests. It's probably the first idea. It was one of the most core ideas behind the story. So it's the core of Pathologic 3's DNA, and so it's very deeply intertwined with the main ideas of the story as we are telling and showing it.
And I would be very surprised if the whole time traveling idea doesn't come with a twist. That there won't be more to it than just, you go ahead and just save scum with the developer's blessing. I certainly have my theories on that already. And what I find really captivating about this approach is that it can also be seen as a sort of meta-commentary on how we play video games. When we have the means to save our games freely, it's pretty common to save scum, repeat certain passages until we've arrived at the desired, perfect outcome. Pathologic 2 already had systems built into its mechanics that actively perceived people's save scumming and preventing it within the framework of the narrative. Pathologic 3 here seems to go even a whole step further, or many steps further, and say outright, okay, you want to keep redoing things until you manage to get it all perfect? Well, go ahead, because that is exactly what The Bachelor is doing diegetically. And something tells me that the very desire to achieve perfection will be fundamentally subverted throughout the narrative of Pathologic 3. That's my theory. See, originally I had intended this video to analyze and philosophically interpret this specific facet of Pathologic 3, digging deep into his affiliated family, the kind's leading ideology, and go on a whole tangent on Nietzschean philosophy, the concept of eternal recurrence, as well as the philosophy of the Übermensch. It's very much in line with what Daniil's quest to conquer death, as well as the kind family's project of finding utopian perfection, was all about in previous games. But I've decided to keep these thoughts in my cabinet for the time being and reevaluate them when I get my hands on Pathologic 3 proper and see if I was onto something, and then potentially make a video on it that focuses on these aspects proper. But hey, in order to at least graze it, Pathologic is an incredibly dense and complex ludo-literary work that explores a wide array of really heady concepts. So, Alphyna, what would you say is the core theme or themes of specifically Pathologic 3 as the Bachelor's Route when it comes to gameplay and the game mechanical metaphors built onto that?
That's a great question. The core themes that we are exploring in this game are A, time, obviously with a non-linear storytelling, but again, it goes deeper than that. B, I'd say balance is the right word, because Dankovsky's psyche, it's not a classic sanity meter, like in Amnesia, where, if your sanity depletes, you start seeing things. It's more complex than that. And this is something that you'll have to struggle with over the course of the whole game. So we found that it is a very fitting metaphor for Daniil specifically. He is a smart man, a very smart man. Yes. And the worst enemy of a smart man is himself. So he'll have to struggle with his own thoughts to actually do things. So that's, I'd say, the second. The third one, I'd say, is the writing word. A lot of things in the game are represented by words for Daniil. He can see ideas and remarks on the walls. I'm not sure it will make it into the game, but we are currently considering making it so when he shoots a revolver, instead of showing a bullet fly out of it, we'll just show the words for it.
Interesting.
Because as an intellectual, he lives in this sort of simulacrum of a world, where reality and truth sometimes become replaced by the signs, the words that mean them. There is this old joke about a fisherman who went to fish, but he forgot the worms. So instead of going back home, he took a piece of paper and wrote a huge worm on it, tied it to his rod and started fishing, and then he felt, the fish. He pulls the rod back up and he sees a piece of paper with the words, a huge fish, written on it.
Yeah.
This modern man, not necessarily modern for our time, but modern for Daniil's time.
Like an enlightened man, sort of.
Yes. The enlightened man tries to remove himself from nature. Generally speaking, that's one of the definitions of civilization, removing yourself from nature.
Yes.
Generally speaking, as humans, we don't have to eat with forks. It's absolutely fine to eat with your hands. But we are inventing these tools to remove ourselves from the basic state of things, and we, humanity as a whole, views this process as beneficial. At least some people, And Daniil is definitely one of those people. So his desire to defeat death is also an attempt to remove himself from the natural state of things. And we want to represent this detachment from the natural state of things on various levels via the instruments of game design.
I'm really excited to see how this is going to play out in the game now. Now, some more things we can conclude from the material shown so far is that the Bachelor will spend quite a bit of time working in the makeshift hospital that's set up in town. He will examine and question patients, inspecting various body parts from various angles in search of symptoms. We then manually track observed and suspected symptoms, as well as patient testimonies, habits, and all kinds of granular data in detailed files that we can cross-reference to actively perform differential diagnoses, so regular medical detective work. That includes analyzing blood and tissue samples taken from patients under the microscope to, for instance, isolate pathogens, and, as it's been stated, critically examine patients' statements and testimonies for inconsistencies. Because as House has taught us,
everybody lies.
Another aspect of the Bachelor's duties gets more administrative/political. As a member of the emergency committee that governs the handling of the pandemic, Dankovsky is being actively put in charge of enacting decrees on the populace. He can enact curfews, put up barter offers for people, order targeted variolation, which is an old method of immunization by inoculating patients with material extracted from patients, I looked that up, hand out equipment and trade it for food, disinfection of areas/buildings, have orderlies perform door-to-door rounds, ensure water filtration, and enact quarantines on various sectors of the town. And these are just the ones that we can see in the footage and screenshots so far. Each decree costs various resources and manpower of the available task force and shows varying positive and negative traits on the statistics and numbers we have available. Hovering over a decree will immediately preview the estimated effect on things like town-wide infection ratio. My hunch is here that there will be a strong dissonance between what the numbers show and what the actual reality out there is. Anyway, this aspect also introduces a new layer of resource management. Aside from private possessions and resource management, which, as we've heard, doesn't include food and water anymore, but probably still medicine and ammunition, I'd assume, the committee's resources have their own pool of resources. And what we can see from the material is rations, i.e. food, equipment, fuel, medicine, and volunteers/orderlies. That's different in different screenshots, so probably still all in development. And it appears like the Bachelor can manage these aspects of his work from his personal office, where we see these elements reflected across his desk and walls. Some other mechanics that come to attention are, for instance, the ability to manually burn pyres with matches, likely as a primitive purification means, I assume. Is that a correct assumption? Can you tell us what function the pyres will have in the game, Alphyna?
Yes, that's one of the mechanics used in infected districts, one of the ways that you interact with the plague itself.
Yeah.
There will be more options,
cool.
But lighting pyres is one of them.
Is there anything you can share about the Plaguefinder? We've seen it in a couple of preview footage and screenshots, how it's going to work in Pathologic 3. It's going to be very similar to how it was in the first, or are there going to be some new twists on it?
Oh, absolutely. We removed it. Yeah, that's one of the weird elements about this sort of crucible development, where you try different ideas and prototype different ideas. So the thing that remains the same is that Daniil is equipped with very high-tech things for the time to combat the plague. That still remains. It's just that the tool that he's using is a bit different, so we've tuned it. This is mostly a gameplay decision. It turns out that constantly switching back and forth between having to look through looking glass and not, it does not create the gameplay feeling that is meaningful and tense, honestly. So you won't need the Plaguefinder to see plague clouds, at least at this point in development. Instead, you have the so-called prototype, a sort of omni-tool that you use to interact with the plague in different ways.
Interesting. All right, that about sums up what I could find that stood out to me in terms of new elements that weren't a thing in Pathologic 2. But I very well might have missed some. Is there anything you'd like to add to this, or correct? Anything I've overlooked, or maybe misinterpreted?
No, I don't think that anything important in our conversation is misrepresented. I think you're very much spot on.
Great.
It's just that there is this core idea that the Bachelor is equipped to fight the plague. But this idea can have different representations, whether it be a Plaguefinder or the prototype, so a sort of another tool, is less important. So these things can change during the development.
Makes sense. So if we would put that all in practice, and without disclosing anything, that's still confidential, of course, but can you try and describe to us like a typical day in the life of Daniil Dankovsky during the outbreak?
Sure. You wake up in the Stillwater, which is a kind of unique house where you were allowed to stay and live. And you try to consider the bigger picture. You try to think, about defeating death, which was your original quest at some point. And you try to think how to save the lives of all these people who are dying in the streets. You try to untangle the social structures of the town and the struggles of the elites and their numerous characters. Then you go down the stairs and you are ambushed by a number of people with idiotic complaints, a number of people who hate you because yesterday you vaccinated them and now they think that you are killing them, with people who abuse and swamp you with the most stupid and minute concerns of theirs, and you try to explain that you're not a ruler, you're not the governor of the town, and please, for fuck's sake, let me... Can I swear?
Yes, absolutely. Please swear to your heart's content.
And please, for fuck's sake, let me do my job. Let me try to investigate, or at least let me try to cure you. But you struggle against this town, against the people who behave like they don't want to be saved, who blame you for things you haven't done. So you try to untangle all the letters that arrive during the night, all the concerned citizens that are banging on your door, and then you try to go into the town and do something and help someone, or more importantly, uncover something and understand something. You also have day-to-day work in the hospital. So every day from the moment when the hospital is open, a number of patients will arrive that you'll have to talk to, diagnose, examine. This is a completely new minigame, and you'll need to investigate the people again who kind of resist their own salvation. And as you understand the plague better, as you investigate it, you'll get the ideas for new executive orders that you will be able to implement that will change the face of the town, and like how aggressive people are, how subdued the plague is, what happens in the streets, things like that. And then you'll realize that you've made a bunch of unrecoverable mistakes the day before yesterday, so you'll need to go back to the Stillwater and try to go back in time and fix those mistakes 2 days ago, because otherwise the character that you really needed to talk to committed suicide or something like that.
All right, so choice and consequence in ways that are virtually impossible to foresee. It also gives me the impression that by reliving days and playing them out in different ways, and thereby also witnessing consequences, many different branches of how things can play out, we're going to slowly start detaching from experiencing the world through the eyes of a mere mortal, almost a bit like a Paul Atreides-like type of prescience, where we start seeing many different possible futures and weighing them against each other, and then slowly understanding that there simply is no perfect path. Like how even Leto II's golden path comes at an enormous cost overall. So fascinating. Yeah, you can tell it already gets my gray cells working on hyperdrive. But alright, so to wrap up our talk about mechanics, are there any other mechanics or elements of Pathologic 3's gameplay that haven't been made public yet, but that you're at liberty to and would like to share with us?
I think that all the important bits have already been shown and mentioned.
Good.
There are some things that we are keeping below the radar, but that's because we want to, unveil them in due time. The only thing I'd say is that I feel that the emphasis in the public eye is a bit wrong. So the mechanics of struggling with their own mind is probably the most important and crucial mechanic in the game, and we've only shown you glimpses of this mechanic, so I don't think people already understand how important it will become.
All right, that's great to hear. Okay, then I'd like to move on to my next focal point and ask you a bit about quarantine. So, alongside Pathologic 2, Icepick Lodge released an additional chapter called Marble Nest, a self-contained capsule experience in which players stepped into the shoes of Daniil Dankovsky, actually, focusing on a single day of the Sand Plague during the 12 days of the outbreak. Pathologic 3 will also feature a standalone prologue chapter with Quarantine that is going to be released before the launch of the main game. From what I gathered, it takes place before and after the events in the town. As the Steam page teases, in Quarantine you will examine patients, uncover strange secrets, and make first steps towards immortality. So I'd love to ask a few questions about Quarantine while we're at it. Alphyna, do you consider it mandatory or at least highly recommended to play Quarantine before diving into Pathologic 3 proper?
Yes, because it would be helpful for marketing purposes.
Yes.
But in terms of story and vision, no. The important bits of Quarantine will be featured in the main game. As basically, it's the game's intro plus some bits from the middle of the game refactored to be tied together in a single coherent story.
Interesting.
So it's not a full side story like the Marble Nest was.
Okay. So in Quarantine, will we also be in the town itself during the events of the plague, or exclusively in the capital?
No. We'll see the town and the plague and happy townsfolk, and we will be able to try the hospital. So lots of activities there.
Just wanting to know, like at the moment on Steam it says releasing February, which is this month. Is there a concrete date that is being considered for the launch of Quarantine?
See, I promised my psychotherapist to never mention dates anymore, but the truth is that I think it will be March, so middle of March.
Okay, good to know. Alright, so I know all hands on deck are currently working hard on The Bachelor, and I know I might be jumping the gun here a little bit, but I just can't resist looking a bit further into the future. the Changeling Route, aka Clara's mischievous odyssey of mayhem and chaos. I'm gonna be honest to admit that ever since Pathologic 2 had been in its Kickstarter phase, way back when, I had been holding my breath for the Changeling Route. And with how blown away I was by Pathologic 2, this feeling has only gotten stronger with time. Clara is my personal favorite of the 3 original protagonists. She's my chaos gremlin, a girl of mysterious origin who just so happens to appear on day 1 of the outbreak, waking up in a shallow grave, and who claims to have healing hands, a miracle healer. Her touch, as it turns out, can completely cure or kill a person, and with that ability, and as a strange embodiment of divine providence, she feels uniquely qualified to face the outbreak. Her reputation takes on a life of its own. People have seen her in various circumstances the days before without her having any recollection of it, and she keeps appearing in multiple places at once, putting up the impression that she has a mischievous doppelganger that keeps pissing in her porch, proverbially. In Pathologic 2, her appearance always feels like an element of unpredictability, who seems to operate under the laws of some otherworldly order whose anatomy is not flesh, but chaos.
Bitch.
And notoriously, the Changeling Route is considered somewhat unfinished in the original Pathologic, with several days just largely repeating, giving the overall impression that this was the part in this humongous beast of a game that had to undergo a lot of cut corners. And I mean, we've already talked about that before. All of this, especially now considering how heavily the Bachelor's path has been re-envisioned from the ground up, makes me incredibly excited for what a potential Changeling Route Pathologic 4 might look like. Now, around the official announcement of Pathologic 3, it has been stated crystal clear that the Changeling Route will come, but that Iceberg Lodge would rather refrain from sharing any details on it in order to not put up any promises or create expectations that won't be possible to be met in the end, and I respect that. But having the chance to ask you directly here, Alphyna, I'm going to take the opportunity and carefully probe a bit. I'm curious, without sharing any details you're not at liberty to disclose at this point in time, does a concept for an eventual Changeling Route already exist?
Oh, I can absolutely tell you that I was actually brought back on board specifically to ensure that Changeling Route happens.
Fantastic.
To oversee its making. And there is a vision document. We don't have the production capabilities currently to do anything more. So it's like an early vision document and pre-production. But the idea is, so as you may have heard, there is another project in development at Iceberg Lodge.
Yes.
Which is, again, kind of the first for the studio ever to have 2 larger projects being created at the same time, which I think is a great sign of stability.
Absolutely, yeah. And structure.
Yes, exactly. Again, so unusual for Iceberg Lodge. So when Pathologic 3 is complete, some of the team will bolster that second unannounced project team, and some people will move on to the Changeling story. That's the idea right now.
Cool. All right. So in this case, do you guys consider to re-envision and redesign Clara's route with a similar, like, from the ground up approach with, like, unique game mechanical and narrative design approach as it's been done now for Daniil's route in Pathologic 3?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. We feel that Clara deserves her own full-fledged story just as much as Artemy and Daniil. So, before you ask, yes, it will be a standalone game. It will probably be called Pathologic 4. It would not make sense to release Artemy and Daniil as separate games and then Clara as a sort of DLC. She deserves her own game, and yes, it will feature new mechanics, new ideas. It will be a full-fledged story just like Pathologic 2 and 3.
That is the best news I've heard in ages. So excited for Clara's route. And I couldn't agree more. Clara's personal viewpoint is also so fundamentally different from both Daniil and Artemy, and also just as interesting. So considering she's been the one who's really gotten the shortest straw in the original Pathologic, she really does deserve to have her story properly realized in the same fashion that it happened with the Haruspex and now the Bachelor. So yeah, I'm smiling ear to ear right now how likely it is that this is going to happen in the future, just so you know.
That's extremely encouraging to hear.
I'm very, very excited for this. With all that said now, as we're wrapping up, I'd love to ask a few questions about the current plans regarding release dates. So according to my research, there's no specific date for Pathologic 3's release that's been made public yet, only that it will come out sometime in 2025. So based on the current state, Can you share a general ballpark? Like, what's more likely for us to expect? A launch in summer, fall, rather to the end of the year? Like, how is the feeling? How is the vibes at the moment?
So I will not give you any specific date
No.
at this point. I'm not ready to do that. I can tell you that it will depend on a content completion, because there is a saying in the industry that a game can never be completed. It can only be released. You know, you can always add something else to the game to make it better. You just have to stop at some point. And finding the right moment to stop is one thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the other is, and I know it might sound hilarious, but it's the release of GTA 6, because it changes the gaming landscape so much.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It takes... So we are absolutely and obviously not competitors with GTA 6. And yet, it takes so much attention.
It takes a lot of oxygen out of the room.
Exactly. And, like, we can't release in the window when the oxygen isn't there.
Yeah.
So we'll have to balance around that, and we're keeping a close eye on, like, any news regarding GTA 6, because they've promised a release this fall, but not necessarily. So here's my honest answer. We're keeping an eye on it.
Is 2025 like a ride or die, no matter what, it must be out in 2025, even if that would mean like brutally cut corners against your own wishes? Or are you guys more inclined and also financially capable to potentially extend development if it turns out it just needs a few more months at some point or something like that?
We have the foundation and the funds to extend development if needed, but we would rather not.
Understandable, yeah. All right, I think we covered quite a lot around today. It really only made me more excited to finally play the final game and the Quarantine Prologue soon, which is funny. I wrote that before, but I can say it's 100% true, so I had a good inkling there. So before we end this video, I'd just like to end on a handful of questions quite directly at you specifically, Alphyna. You've worked on major roles on both Pathologic 2 and now 3. What would you say, as a whole, setting, story, lore, characters, and this complex ideological, philosophical gestalt of the series means to you personally?
We have a lot of video games that are informed by movies and by cinema in general, in the storytelling language. We have a lot of games with concepts that arise from mathematics created by people who like puzzles, who have sometimes incredible ideas. But to me personally, we don't get enough games informed by literature and theater. Not saying Pathologic is unique in this regard, but we don't get enough of them. And this is what I really appreciate about the story and lore and everything. And I've also worked in more traditional game development for 5 years, in between, me being at ISP Cloud. And I personally missed this idea of creating mechanics not for a good gameplay loop, but to convey some sort of meaning and idea. Again, not unique. A lot of developers, especially indie developers, do this. But Pathologic also has the luck to be of a bit higher scope than many very brave and interesting indie games created by like one person or a very small team. And this is what I truly, genuinely appreciate about this now franchise.
You mentioned earlier Rashomon by Kurosawa, but do you personally also have any major artistic/literary inspirations that inform your work on Pathologic?
Well, I feel that literally any person of my age that comes from a post-USSR country has been inspired by the Strugatsky brothers at some point. Somehow they're all-encompassing, even though it's kind of... Sci-fi is considered as this sort of low genre by some people. Theirs is different and very important. I rely on some postmodern works, like Umberto Eco, for example.
It's my favorite author of all of them.
Oh,
yes.
Well, then we match.
Yes.
Obviously, it won't come as a surprise that I am strongly inspired by the classic Russian literature like Dostoevsky and Chekhov, for example, and of course Bulgakov. Bulgakov is interesting here, first of all, because he was a doctor who came from the capital and had to work in smaller towns, and a lot of his frustrations obviously inspired Daniil. But also, he's one of the first writers who wrote things that we would consider sci-fi by modern modern standards in the Russian language. And since Daniil comes from the capital, since he has this like new devices that he uses to fight the plague, for example, you could say that Pathologic 3 has some sci-fi elements. Sci-fi, like in huge air quotes.
Well, I mean, if we want to be pedantic, Daniil is operating fictional science devices. They don't necessarily have to be from the future in order to qualify as sci-fi. But I also get your point, since despite that, nobody would call Pathologic a sci-fi story. And I also think with a hard genre signifier like that, there also comes a certain set of expectations in the audience that really isn't something Pathologic, I think, has any desire to meet at all.
Yeah, it's just that, it creates a very different expectation. Hence exactly. The air quotes. But what's actually very important to me personally is to make sure that Pathologic preserves its own personality and does not lean towards a more classic steampunk.
Yeah.
Because, like the science of the early 20th century is steampunk, but the world of Pathologic is more inspired by Russian modernism and honestly by LARPs, by live-action role-playing games, because like the people in the town dress anachronistically. And generally speaking, the core concept behind the story has always been that, yeah, it's inspired by early 20th century Russia, but it's not early 20th century Russia. It's more of its archetype. So we don't need to lean into realism at all. So it's either like all those people are role-playing or they're playing on stage. That's why their outfits can be impractical, there may be anachronistic elements. So while I think that for the original creators of Pathologic, the inspiration strongly came from theater, to me it's also from live-action RPGs, honestly. So that's an unusual source of inspiration for you.
Actually, that's a source of inspiration I didn't expect at all, but that's also super fascinating, and I could totally see it. All right, so another thing I wanted to ask you is, if you're able to share this, or if you even know, what are your plans post-Pathologic 3? Do you intend to stay on the team and potentially continue working on Pathologic 4, which, it looks like that's the case, or any other projects that's planned after Pathologic 3 is out?
Well, hopefully, I'll have the opportunity to work on the Changeling's Route. Maybe I'll watch this video in 2 years and have a hysterical laugh.
I hope not. I sincerely hope you're going to watch this video sometime from now and find out that, yeah, for once, things actually went the way you were hoping to. Here's to hoping. All right, so what can I say? Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, for all the insights and musings. Do you have any final words? Sounds so grim. Anything you'd like to say to the audience before we say goodbye?
Honestly, I feel that we are still living in an incredible age for video games. The industry struggles sometimes with corporate interventions changing studios, with people being laid off and then hired again in weird ways, with the oversaturation of the market. A lot of products are coming out, a lot of great and interesting games, and players don't necessarily always have the time and attention to try them all. But at least the latter is kind of a good problem to have. I genuinely, honestly feel blessed to have this opportunity to work on video games in this time when we can try different things in this studio, which has its unique traits, and by that I mean chaos sometimes, but which is truly a collective of unique individuals with bright minds who are not afraid to try different things, who listen to each other a lot, and a lot of people contribute. And yet, decisions are made by people with clear vision. So, honestly, I'm just so happy to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, Alphyna, thanks again for your time. I really had a blast, and I honestly got so many more answers and revelations than I had expected or hoped for. And I can honestly say, I'm now even more excited to finally get my hands on Pathologic 3 once it comes out. So I wish you and the team best of luck and smooth sailing for the rest of the development process.
Thank you very, very, very much, and I'll be happy to talk to you more sometime if an opportunity arises.
Anytime, it will be my pleasure. All right, wonderful. I'm very much looking forward to freeing some time in my calendar later this year to book a rejuvenating vacation to town on Gorkon once the game hits the shelves. And thanks, of course, to you, dear viewer, for sticking around to the end of this video. Do you have any questions about Pathologic 3 that weren't brought up in this video so far? Any hopes, dreams, expectations, speculations, theories, you name it, then please feel absolutely free to put them in the comments. Maybe you'll get an answer and uncover some new revelations even, who knows? Thank you so much for watching. In case you haven't seen it, I put the link to the Pathologic 2 video from a few years ago in the description of this video, and in case this was your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on this channel I've been covering old games, indie games, horror games, and combinations thereof now for 10 years. Yeah, it's actually been the official channel's 10-year anniversary just a few days ago. So wow, time really flies. For anyone who's subscribed and stuck with me no matter for how long, thank you a ton for the support over all this time. And I can give you my word, I'm not even close to being finished. There's an almost overwhelming amount of really cool projects coming up in the next 2-3 months if all goes well. Some I can't even talk about yet because I'll be covering some really exciting games that aren't even out yet. Another big goal for this year is to finally delve into some of the most notorious 90s FMV horror games ever made. Iconic titles such as Phantasmagoria, Gabriel Knight 2, Darkseid. I really also want to spotlight the 1997 X-Files FMV game too. I have a massive soft spot for it. And of course, the infamous Harvester is ripe for a critical re-examination if you ask me.
Don't mind if I do.
I've been wanting to do that for ages, and to kick things off and get into gear, so to speak, I actually released a video this month for my backers in which I talk about the phenomenon of 90s FMV games from the perspective of today and my thoughts and musings and plans on it for a solid half hour, sort of a primer for what I'm planning to cover, among other things, over the course of the next year or so. But speaking of my backers, the work on this channel's main source of sustenance has been, for many years now, the monthly donations of my Patreon supporters. It is what enables me to do what I love, doing in the way I want to do it, and that's awesome. The ultimate goal is to eventually get to a point where even sponsorships are absolutely not necessary anymore for the bottom line. Not there yet, but I went a bit more into detail about this topic in the credits of my last video, and so many of you have pitched in and showed their support, and I'm just so incredibly thankful for it. Genuinely. And hey, as I mentioned, I've enjoyed the backer platform for quite a while as a means to create content that I wouldn't upload on my regular channel normally, more experimental stuff and thematically things that are a bit different, like video essays that don't make the cut for the main channel, sometimes let's plays, and recently I released a dramatic reading of Lovecraft's Dagon, all kinds of stuff. There's a whole library of videos that are available to new backers straight away, so if you want to check out all the bonus videos that are out by now, here's a link, which you'll also find in the description of this video, to a little website I made where I catalog them all in one neat place, and I'll also update it whenever something new comes out. Go check it out if you're curious. And with that, I say thanks, and I hope to see you in the next video, and I'll leave, as always, with a heartfelt shout out to these lovely supporters. Vasily Prokhorov, Thragum, LSNHNG, Gehennas, Dana Rosa, Swiss Hackmod, Laird Wackula, Billy Lott, Billy Stein, Corey Marr, Vincent Kavanaugh, Righteous Itch, Felix D, Link Hughes, Uziel 1447, Nathan Gillick, Catherine Escobar, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Giselle, Jin Hansen, Angelo Benedetti, Tabby, Alfred Correa, J.R. Smith, Morrigan K, Aurora Milpomene Crescendo, Ronan Crom aka Daniil 242172, Ari Orson, Kenan Ward, Aria, Thomas Brunner, Jean, Nineball 9606, Zodi, Kyle Lee, Nikot the Brave, Sable Cowl, Chrissy, Chuck Taylor, Shannon Blue, Terraflops, Hendrik van Rensselaer, Kerry George, John Boring, Amber Wiggins, Matt Gretton, Glebin, Sulmatul, David Zelenak, Casper Ram, and the Spiral Architect. Until next time, ta-ta!